Welcome back to the Morbid Moonlight 31 Days of Halloween, where every day this month we're going to be reviewing a different film featuring legendary horror star Felissa Rose, working our way through her career, one film at a time, picking out the high points and hopefully avoiding the dross to give you all a history of Felissa Rose in 31 horror films. This time round we're going to be looking at a 2009 slasher film called Deadly Little Christmas. Now, Deadly Little Christmas is a film that comes to us from a guy who you may or may not be familiar with, who calls himself David Sterling, whose various production companies are, in this iteration, Sterling Entertainment, has been churning out ultra-low budget films now for a lot longer than most people realise, going all the way back to 1993 on a film called Things. Maybe you don't know the name, but if you hang around cheap American straight-to-DVD horror films for too long, chances are you'll end up watching a David Sterling movie. I think his greatest achievement, if you can call it that, is the Camp Blood series, which continues to churn out your kind of basic killer clown slashers year after year, and he's also somehow ended up as the guy making the last 5 or 6 witchcraft films. Like a lot of low-budget mavericks, David Sterling has obviously figured out that the best way to get money from horror fans is to either stick a number in the title and market your stuff as a franchise, or to just do the classic try and look like a popular film that's out right now, and hope people buy your stuff without thinking, which is a trick that loads of low-budget filmmakers actually try. But I always wondered just how sustainable a strategy that really is. I mean, how stupid are these people that you're targeting? But anyway, David Sterling is a producer here, and I suppose that Deadly Little Christmas has got that certain feel to it. Although I've got to admit that there's worse things than David Sterling films, although don't expect any standards of professionalism here, to be brutally honest. At least this one's playing things more or less seriously, and when that happens, the end result is that you often get that genuine kind of Ed Wood thing, where stuff is funny because it's so earnestly terrible. Although that said, I actually don't think Deadly Little Christmas is terrible, just some parts of it really do show its limitations, shall we say. What we've got here is really a pretty straightforward Halloween ripoff about a young kid who kills his father whilst he's dressed as Santa. The kid gets taken off to the asylum, and the family is left in tatters. Cut to several years later, and we follow the boy's 2 older sisters, Taylor and Noelle, who are putting on a Christmas play in a community centre that seems to house about 14 people. And surprise, surprise, the homicidal brother escapes from the asylum, and people start dying. We've got a masked killer, seasonal atmosphere, and a pretty tried and tested storyline that seems so basic that it more or less demands that we're looking for a twist. Felissa Rose is on hand to play the mother here, and she does, I'd say, a pretty decent job, although there's definitely moments when she's in scenes that are shot in such a way that would make anybody look bad, to be honest. I know that sounds like shifting the blame, but there's a certain level where you can just plonk the camera down, light everything in the blandest way possible, do really long takes with bad sound, coupled with this really kind of overcooked dialogue, and I think there's definitely lines of dialogue in Deadly Little Christmas that are pretty terrible, that more or less are going to look bad no matter what. But I mean, yeah, there's a lot of fairly amateur stuff on display here, and that's fine in its own way because it's well intentioned, and believe it or not, it does actually go somewhere. Deadly Little Christmas has got quite a solid storyline for what it is. It's not just one of those films that fannies about for 70 minutes and then it just ends in this huge mess. Without wanting to really spoil what happens, there's a pretty legit final confrontation that I'd say is actually worth the wait. I actually think as well that Felissa Rose really gets a chance to shine here, and this is probably one of her better parts for a long time. She brings this spark to her scenes that livens things up even when the direction is pretty subpar. I think I'd probably say about half the actors here are decent and half are less than decent, but again, if you're used to this level of acting, then there's nothing that I've really got a problem with, although the cast is necessarily quite small. In terms of kills and violence, it's got a solid range of pretty low-budget gore scenes that do the job, although I think the award for craziest death has got to go to the dude who just goes through a full 15 seconds of convulsions before dying, just because the guy really gives it his all. I think as well that if we're labelling this as a Halloween ripoff, which it quite clearly is, although aesthetically and stylistically obviously it's got nothing in common with any of the Halloween films, I'm actually quite impressed by our characters' cavalier attitudes to the traumas of their past. Personally, I think a lot of writers really fetishise trauma and victimhood as an excuse to just indulge in really crappy soap opera. So that whole kind of so what approach is actually pretty refreshing, especially compared with some of the actual Halloween sequels that go for the easy dramatic cul-de-sac of saying that realistically, if you went through all this stuff, it'd fuck you up. We've done that, it's boring, move on. I mean, that's not why people watch slasher films after all, is it? You know, I'd really like to talk spoilers here, but out of deference to the fact that I actually think that Deadly Little Christmas isn't half bad, I'm not going to. but it does have a pretty meaty and interesting role for Felissa Rose, which means that I'm going to throw down a nice solid Felissa factor of 6 out of 10 for this one. The Felissa factor, of course, being how important a film is for fans of Felissa Rose and how important she is in the film as a whole. She is very important to this one and gets a chance to show quite a different side to herself to what we're used to seeing, and even though it's necessarily quite a cheap looking and I'd say flatly directed film, it is pretty entertaining as a little throwback slasher. I reckon about 4.5 out of 10 for this one seems fair, although I could maybe go for 5 out of 10 at a push if I was in a good mood. The cheapness is a problem. The acting is not amazing for the most part, but I think it's no longer than it needs to be, about 75 to 80 minutes, and I think Felissa Rose gives a cool performance this time around. If you like yourself nice, simple slasher films that don't feel the need to be painfully self-aware and smothered in irony and winks to the camera all the time, then I think The Deadly Little Christmas is an entertaining, very low-budget little horror film. Give it a watch, but be warned, the DVD is basically impossible to find, probably due to its very small initial print run, as is the way with a lot of these sort of films. It's weird the way things work out, which films are really hard to get and which ones you literally can't move for. Anyway, I reckon that should probably wrap things up for day 6 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. Thanks a lot for watching, hope you enjoyed. Please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, that would be a great help, and I will see you back here tomorrow with day 7 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. Hope to see you then.